Hi everyone, Annette Evans with On Our Own here, and I am here with InRange today. Carl's decided to let me be a little nerdy with all of you, and I'm super looking forward to this because we're going to be nerdy about concealing a gun. Because in the beginning, we all had this general idea that the size of the gun would make a difference when it comes to how well you can conceal it, how comfortable it is to carry, how able you are to make sure nobody else can see your gun. And we had this idea that smaller guns were better, and certain guns were easy to conceal, and certain guns weren't. But it turns out that that's not actually true for the entire range of bodies that exist. So then we got to this idea that we're going to look at certain dimensions of the gun, and that's going to help us decide if it's actually small or actually large, easy to conceal or not conceal. And the first thing that we all looked at, and this was pretty smart actually, is we looked at the height of the gun. We went from the base of the grip to the top of the slide, and we went, well, that's going to be something that's going to matter on whether or not I can hide that gun in my body. And it turns out that that was a really, really important bit of math. And then we started looking at the thickness of the gun from side to side and went, well, you know, I don't want to size up my pants, or I have to buy pants that are 3 sizes larger in order to shove my gun into it. So slimmer guns are better. We got that idea. And we did have this idea that the length of the slide would probably make a difference, especially for people carrying appendix and wanting to sit down. But there wasn't a whole lot of objectivity to that. And the idea was just smaller gun better. You would try to get the smallest gun that you could get that you could actually shoot, and that was the way you were going to pick the gun. But that required a lot of trial and error, and I don't know how many of you have a whole bunch of guns and a whole bunch of holsters while you tried to figure this out. So then we got to Filster, who's a company that I've worked with a lot over the last 10 years, John Hopman and now Sarah and some other folks, and they started systemizing this a little bit. And one of the concepts that started coming up from that crew was the idea of peaks and valleys. And then what your body is not a box, it's not a cube, you're not a Lego man, and you have, you know, we all have that little bit of pot belly probably, or you have, you know, a part of your body that naturally comes in a little bit more. We talk about them as peaks and valleys, and we talk about fitting your gun into them, and we talk about using wedges or claws or things to turn the gun so that this blocky flat object can fit into that peak and valley. And it became a little bit more scientific on how to hide the gun. It wasn't just buy this holster and you will have success. It was buy this holster, do these couple of things, fit the gun into your valley, and you'll have a little bit more success concealing. But that didn't really answer like what gun should I buy. It helped you optimize the gun that you wanted to use. And then Tessa from Armed and Styled, as a newer person to the gun community, the concealed carry community, noticed one day that her Glock 48 looked a lot bigger on her than her husband's Glock 34. And we're like, wonder what that's about. And she came up with this idea called the concealment percentage. And the concealment percentage is really, really simple. We look at this dimension of the gun, the height of the gun, and we compare it to the measurement between your hip bones. And we take that percentage, and we can now say that somewhere around 30 or 40% for most people is where the gun becomes easy and comfortable to conceal. And when you get larger than that, it's a lot harder. That helps a lot, but it turns out that didn't answer all of the questions. We would all go on Handgun Hero, and we'd say, well, this gun is a 1/4 inch shorter, so therefore it's going to be easier to conceal. Or this gun is the same size as that gun, so it's clearly going to be impossible to conceal because I can't hide that gun. And it turns out that's not really true. That's all the introduction, right? There's all the background. Here's where the nerdery comes in. So I think that by looking at just these 3 dimensions of the gun, we've decided the gun is a block. And guns aren't. Guns have all sorts of different shapes and sizes that are encompassed in those measurements. And I think we can make some better predictions about what gun will be easy for you individually to hide when we start looking at some of those other things. Here's one of the other dimensions that matters, is we're looking at the length of the gun. And traditionally that's one that we've kind of dismissed as sort of like the last bit that matters. Turns out that now that we can carry safely and comfortably in not real pants, which is to say pants that have a little bit less structure, this dimension, the length of the gun, matters more for a problem that we indelicately call gun dick. And gun dick is that problem of where you stick that gun down your pants and it starts sticking out a little bit. And you're like, is that your gun, or are you happy to see me? And it's no longer a joke because you can really see something stick out there. And it turns out that a shorter gun or a gun carried higher can reduce that problem. So now we're starting to look at the length of the gun compared to the length of your torso. And this is an area where research is continuing and observations are continuing on how we measure that and how we map that out. But for right now, we can think about, hey, if your waistline or your valley is such that the length of the gun is going to go beyond that valley, or going to go beyond, your waistline, you're probably going to have a little bit more trouble, especially with below the belt printing. Here's another thing that we know, is we've talked about a slimmer gun is easier to hide, but we haven't talked about why, which means we don't really understand how that actually affects you. And here's the dimensions that I'm thinking about when it comes to that, is how thick is the gun compared to how thick am I from front to back. So if I take a really, really thick gun, and I have here, this is a SIG 226 with a TLR1 on it in a light bearing Enigma Express. And in order to get good concealment with it, I need to put a wedge on it to tuck the gun into my body. So you can see how thick this is. But if you think about how thick this is compared to my body, you see why it might be hard to conceal is because it's this thick, and that's like half of my thickness. And that's really hard to hide, even if I could say, well, my shirt is going to drape over it. And like, my shirt is going to drape over it like a giant pot belly. And maybe that's okay, and that's a compromise I'm willing to make. But if not, that's something I need to think about. It's not just slimmer gun better, but gun that is proportionally something slim for me might be better. There's two other pieces that I think that we need to think about beyond these traditional boxy dimensions of the gun. And one of them is the shape of the gun itself. So when we think about the grip, all we've really looked at so far is this dimension of the grip. But notice how blocky this is. This is a Glock 19 blue gun, and it's kind of a chunker that way. And a lot of people will go, well, I'll get a Glock 48. It's slimmer, it's easier to conceal. Here's the problem. A Glock 48 is in fact slimmer. It is otherwise dimensionally the same, but what I think really makes a difference is where the grips are similarly blocky. Because here's another example, is dimensionally, a Beretta 80X Cheetah is very similar height-wise to that 19. You can see that lined up here. And here's the difference. Look at the grip of the 19 compared to the grip of this Cheetah. And also, take a look at the back of the slide. The 19, super blocky back here, right? It's just a sharp angle. The back of this Cheetah, kind of, even with the beaver tail sticking out, it's kind of a little bit more angled. And I'm going to make a suggestion here, and this is based on the folks that I know who carry J-frames a lot. And here is my infamous flashbang gun. It's got those nice rounded grips and all these beautiful little curves. If you think about, if you go back to the peaks and valleys we talked about earlier, what do the peaks and valleys on your body look like? Do you have square cutouts like Lego Man? Or do you have this sort of like soft, curvy little piece of your body that you're going to try to put that gun into? I'm going to suggest that that soft, curvy little piece of your body might be easier to fit that gun into than a blocky thing that you're trying to do. Even if these were the same size, this is going to just have more sharp angles and corners that you're trying to fit into that round and to try to drape clothing over. And the size of that grip is, just an extra piece of that blockiness. Where when you have a smaller one of the easiest guns to conceal on the market right now is the 365. Look at this tiny little thing. This tiny little grip. Yeah, it can be challenging to shoot, and that's a different problem when it comes to concealment and what gun should you carry. But how easy is it for me to fit this into my body, drape some clothing over it and make it more organic to my shape. So in the beginning, in concealment and wax, we had a general idea that smaller guns were better. And then we had this idea of we need to fit a flat, boxy object into the contours of our body, the peaks and the valleys. And then we had this idea, the concealment percentage, where we could start mathing out the proportions of gun to body and what's going to be easy to hide and where we can put it. But what I'm proposing here is we need to think a little bit more critically about smaller pieces of those measurements. We need to think about the fact that as boxy as a Glock is, guns are not boxes and bodies aren't boxes. And there's other measurements that matter and other proportions that matter. So instead of just looking at, well, how high is the gun compared to how much space I have to put it across, we need to think about, is the gun able vertically to be where it needs to be? And is the gun going to come out so far from my body that it's going to cause a lot of extra protrusion, maybe some printing, maybe some discomfort? And then we also need to think about the fact that when we measure gun by length and height and width, we are measuring a box. And that box alone doesn't give us enough information about what's inside the box. And, you know, insert whatever internet joke you want to do there, because I'm going to acknowledge that I totally just said that. But if we think about, hey, if that box has some angles in it that are a little different, if that box isn't completely filled in the same way because the grip is a little bit more narrow from front to back, if we're going to acknowledge that, you know, maybe the curves are going to change how it fits inside that box. So, you know, the height of a revolver is measured like that, but look at all this extra space. And maybe we can fit that into our valleys of our body a little bit better. And maybe it's going to be a little bit more comfortable to carry, a little bit easier to conceal.